Welcome to Real World, Real Talk with Dr. D.Z. Cofield. This show represents captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. D.Z. Cofield.
Welcome to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com, and on the Real World, Real Talk podcast network. Let me say, first of all, for those of you I have not spoken to yet, I think I'm still within the rules of etiquette. Happy New Year. Hopefully your new year has started off really well. Hopefully you haven't abandoned your New Year's resolutions yet, eating right and losing weight and taking care of yourself and spending more me time and all of those things. But if not, I hope and pray that you get back on track really quick. Just a couple of things before we get started. Housekeeping. If you want to follow me during the week, you can follow me on Instagram at DZ Cofield. You can follow me on Twitter at DZ Cofield, and you can follow me on Facebook at, you guessed it, DZ Cofield. Want to send a special shout out to a couple of families that I know who are in bereavement. We want to remember the family and the church family of Pastor Calvin Abraham. Pastor Abraham's homegoing celebration was on February the 12th. And I know his family members and friends certainly miss him. He was just a jewel and a gem for me personally, just a source of encouragement. Always had positive things to say, and we certainly will miss him. And then we also want to remember the family of Mr. Edwin Charles Harrison, who was a person who fought for equal rights and equal opportunities for people before it became popular, before it was even mandated on a county level. He made sure people had equal access. He and others like Commissioner Elfranco Lee made sure that people had opportunities. And we celebrated his homegoing on February the 12th as well. And so we certainly want to remember those families in prayer, friends, and those who have been touched and impacted by the lives of those two men. I'm excited for today's show because we're going to talk about a subject that we hear about a lot in the news. But if you're like me, you really haven't been able to put your arms around it, really get a handle on it. And we have an expert with us to talk about this subject on today, and that's climate change. But don't turn me off yet, because it's not just about climate change. It's also about environmental injustice and what we see happening in communities of color or not happening, whether it's toxic dumping, failure to clean up areas, higher incidences of cancer and arthritis and other illnesses. There are a lot of things that are going on in our communities of color, not just in this city, but around our state and around our country. And we need to ask some questions in terms of where are we going in the world today, and how do we remedy some of the issues that are plaguing our society. Today, I'm happy to have with me in our virtual studio, Dr. Sylvia D. She is an assistant professor of climate and atmospheric sciences at Rice University. Her research focuses on a wide topics related to the current and forthcoming challenges of climate change, including severe weather, flooding, heat waves, and drought. She received her PhD in Earth Sciences from the University of Southern California, an undergraduate degree in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Princeton University, and held postdoctoral fellowships at Brown University and UT Austin before starting at Rice in 2018. We're happy to welcome to Real World, Real Talk, Dr. Sylvia D. Thank you for being with us today, and welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you today. I'm delighted to have the invitation.
So here's my thought. Whenever I have problems like this in terms of technology or just things happen, that just means it's going to be a really, really great show. And somehow the forces in the world don't want us to talk about it because there's going to be something substantive that comes out of this show. So, Dr. D, I heard you on our sister show here at KTSU, Impact Houston Live. You and Annie Shu were on, and man, I was just so impressed. And I said, you know what? I've got to have her on and give her the whole time just to talk about what's going on about climate change, but also about environmental injustice, what's happening in communities of color. You know, there's almost this Darwinian, social Darwinian, I guess, kind of survival of the fittest, and that these things are just happening by chance, that they're not intentional, they're not by design. And you know, the facts really say exactly the opposite. So as we get started, let's first start with just the basics. Define for our listening audience what climate change is, because you know, you hear it in the news, and you know, I think anecdotally there are many of us who are saying, boy, you know, the weather just seems really, really strange. You know, it wasn't near as hot when we were kids as the hots. It wasn't near as cold as the colds are. You know, the seasons, you know, it's almost like the earth seems confused. You know, we're wearing coats in the summertime and wearing shorts in the wintertime. Help us understand, what is climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you mentioned, climate change encompasses so many aspects of global change. And we used to refer to the phenomena of climate change as global warming. But as we've seen over the past several decades, there are so many manifestations of warming up the atmosphere that are changing our weather and climate patterns year to year and season to season. So climate change refers to the fact that we are putting additional greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Those greenhouse gases effectively trap outgoing heat from the earth and warm up the planet. And so ever since the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning fossil fuels such as coal and oil, we've been heating up our Earth's atmosphere and oceans. Now, without getting into a long physics lecture, the manifestations of that atmospheric heating and the ocean heating can be everything from stronger tropical cyclones and hurricanes to more intense flooding events to increased prevalence of heat waves. One of the things we know about future climate change in Texas is that the number of days over 100 degrees could change from anything from 1 month to 3 additional months for South Texans. So to give a brief summary of that answer, climate change really refers to all of the different ways in which our emissions of greenhouse gases are changing our climate system.
So a couple of things come to my mind. I was watching a 60-minute show not long ago, and they were saying that there's a major shift taking place in terms of the wine making industry. Yeah. That there are areas, for example, in France that were, you know, large producers of fine quality Bordeaux's and the like, and they're having major problems in grape production and dealing with droughts and the like. And then you have areas that were really never known as great wine producing areas like England, who are now experiencing this warm trend. And now they're producing like these fantastic wines. And so that was one incident. The other one that struck me, and I think everybody saw those pictures, when we were in the midst of the pandemic and we saw the world shut down and we saw pollution evaporate over large cities in our world, and we saw wildlife, birds flying, and we saw mountain ranges that nobody had seen in years, and the like. I really was hoping and was thinking maybe this is a wake-up call. Like maybe people will see these images and pictures and go, huh, maybe we are driving a little too much. Maybe we need to stop burning the fossil fuels. Is that all a part of this whole global warming, as you described it, or climate change? Some of the symptoms, I guess, that we're seeing?
Absolutely. So I'll start with your first comment about wine, because I'm also fascinated by that topic. Now is really the time to invest in wineries in Canada. So I've heard many reports about people who are winemakers in Napa, California, for example. They're having to shift their production further north into Oregon and Washington to make the same kind of wine. So we're seeing a shift towards colder areas, higher latitudes for the same type of wine production, just like you mentioned with France and England. And there's actually a lot of climate scientists and economists who are working with winemakers to figure out how those changes will affect their entire industry. On the second point, so it's really important to draw a distinction between carbon pollution and greenhouse gas pollution as opposed to point source air pollution. And so when we think of pollutants like ozone, particulate matter, mercury, these are things that are short-lived in the atmosphere, but they have dramatic impacts on human health. Carbon and methane, these types of greenhouse gases are long-lived in the atmosphere, up to 400 years, and they change the global energy budget and make the atmosphere warmer, but they won't have impacts on human respiratory infection, for example. So when COVID started, the pollutants that come out of transportation exhaust, for example, that are short-lived in the atmosphere, those pollutant levels did come down in the short term. So you might have heard of nitrous oxides, for example. We did see a dip in a lot of those point source pollutants. A lot of studies have also shown a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but it was nowhere near enough to put a dent in our current climate change crisis. So it was very fascinating to see wildlife come back temporarily to some of these areas, but most of those changes have been attributed to just the lack of humans being around. Some of the water quality issues were definitely improved by the lack of boat traffic, for example. But unfortunately, we cannot expect in our growing global economy for those reductions to persist.
Yeah, I think that's what I found fascinating. Not that it would result in long-term changes, but just seeing the short-term results, it was like, whoa, like
Yeah,
wow, like
absolutely.
man, animals showing back up. It was like, holy cow. I just, because a lot of times I think with climate change and the admonitions that we're getting from scientists like yourself that we need to do something, I think a lot of times as individuals, we don't think we really can make a difference. And I guess just in a very short term, we saw that when people didn't drive as much, when people weren't using gas powered vehicles, whether on land, in the air, on the water, that a significant difference was made. And we just, like you said, it wasn't major, it wasn't long lasting, but just seeing that difference made, it was kind of like, wow, okay. You just recently wrote a paper that I'd like for you to share with our audience around this subject and environmental injustice and the like. Share that with the audience, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So when the pandemic began, a few professors at Rice got together and thought there's a unique opportunity to study the environmental impacts of the pandemic and also the economic cost of the pandemic to our local communities in Texas. So in collaboration with earth scientists and civil engineers and economists, we basically recruited a team of 10 undergraduate students to study the codependencies between human health, air quality, and COVID infection. And so that paper came out a couple weeks ago in a journal called Scientific Reports. And essentially what we found is that race and ethnic minority are strongly correlated to infection and mortality. And we were able to break that down by county in Texas and also focus study within Harris County. And in collaboration with my colleague Ted Lockton-Zelita, economics professor, we essentially measured cost to different communities of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Wow. So let's talk about the health ramifications of COVID. I just recently recovered from COVID, and what I told people and have been telling people is that my symptoms were minor. I just had a slight cough, maybe a minor headache, but nothing that I would even have to take, pain medicine for. But I suffered some internal damage. So my blood pressure went up. It was like 210 over 120. My wife was asking me, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm fine." And she was like wondering like what was going on. I also experienced some liver damage, and I've always contended that, I think measuring the impact of COVID, death versus life, was an inaccurate way or an insufficient way to measure the impact of COVID. That there were more things besides death that we needed to be concerned about. What are some of the things that you all discovered in your research?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm so sorry that you became ill, and I wish you the speediest of recoveries. And, like so many other people who have been infected with COVID, me included, right? Some of the respiratory symptoms have been mild, but there are these other symptoms that are impacting our lives in very dramatic ways. One of the ways we measured the impacts that you're describing is using a metric called the value of statistical life, which sounds horrifying, right? But essentially it measures things like lost income, financial burden, emotional costs, and it really represents a lower bound of the costs associated with COVID-19, because again, it's completely impossible to put a dollar amount on the challenges of death and disease. So one of the things we found in our study was, again, there's a disproportionate impact on our minority communities in Harris County. For example, our Latino and Latinx populations make up only 33% of our population, but bore about 45% of the cost. So that's a disproportionate impact. Our Black communities are less than 15% of the population, and yet they shouldered 25% of the economic losses. So these numbers are stark. And just to put that in perspective, our Asian and Asian American communities shouldered almost exactly the amount of cost in proportion to their population, whereas our white communities are 45% of the population and bore only 24% of the cost. And when you're able to quantify the damage to each of these different racial communities, it sends a very dark message about our inability to serve our different ethnic communities equally in Harris County.
So if you can break down what you mean when you say cost, because I can imagine somebody's hearing that and they may be trying to get their arms around it anecdotally, but what are some key markers, some key statistical things that said, this is what is happening, this is what is going on?
Yeah, so again, it's really impossible to put dollar amounts on people's lives. But what we did is we took race and ethnicity data from the Harris County COVID dashboard and the Texas Department of State Health Services. And we essentially came up, again, I'm an atmospheric scientist and not an economist, but put simply, there are ways to assign values to lost income, financial burden due to death and disease. And it's possible to do that by age group and by race and ethnicity. And so when we talk about the cost or the financial burden, that is being calculated as a function of the mortality rates within different populations and what that implies for those people.
Wow. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your community station, KTSU 90.9, The Choice, here on the campus of Texas Southern University. Dr. D, you mentioned codependence of respiratory disease and air quality and how that has come into play. Have you all been able to determine or discover the relationship between COVID, a respiratory disease like COVID, and what's going on with climate change? And, because we heard all kinds of things that, when it gets cold, it's going to subside. When it gets warm, it's going to subside, and neither one has worked, right? and it's just, it's just been kind of rolling along, and variants have been coming and going. What's the relationship between all of those things? Have you all been able to discover that?
Yeah, so there's a number of studies that have come out over the past 2 decades or so that show that there is a strong correlation between air quality and respiratory infection. So, for example, asthma is exacerbated by environmental pollution. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the foundational work of Dr. Robert Bullard, who's a Texas Southern professor. He did some of the first work correlating things like landfills and location proximity to incinerators to health outcomes. Beyond air quality, which, as you can imagine, exacerbates respiratory infection because it's literally putting particulate matter into your lungs, just like smoking. Climate change and high temperatures have also exacerbated health outcomes. So you may have heard last year, there was a big study for Texas and people who work outdoors and their health outcomes for extreme heat. And we found that a lot of people are dying because they are exposed to heat extremes and they're dying of heat stroke. But there are some silent killers in here as well. So there was a study in the New York Times that came out a couple of years ago with the headline, "Climate Change Tied to Pregnancy Risks Affecting Black Mothers Most." And so high heat and environmental pollution is tied to premature, underweight, and stillborn birth. And so in our particular study, unfortunately, we didn't have zip code level air quality data. And it's quite difficult to obtain the granularity of air quality that you need to do this study for Harris County. That being said, there are studies that have come out in the past that look at rates of cancer for people who live closer to the ship channel or people who live closer to highways. And so if we broaden that out a bit, we do see this strong correlation between human health and pollution. In our study, we found that race and ethnicity is a better predictor of health outcomes for COVID-19. That being said, I have no doubt that if we had the zip code level air quality data, we would absolutely see a relationship between COVID-19 and deaths. Because as I mentioned, we already know that poor air quality is spatially related to where our minority communities are housed in Harris County.
Let's talk about environmental justice, or as some would rather say, environmental injustice.
Yeah.
And the disproportionate effect that poor air quality has on communities of color, especially in regards to health outcomes. You all have done some tremendous research in that area, and I think that the evidence at least appears to be overwhelming to me. I'd like to see if it's overwhelming to my listening audience as well. What are some of the things that you all have discovered when we talk about the disproportionate effect that environmental injustice is having on communities of color?
So, as I mentioned, my expertise is somewhat limited to climate change and atmospheric circulation. But if I can, speak to the environmental justice literature that's come out, not but by colleagues around the United States, everyone in the world is affected by environmental pollution. The World Health Organization shows that pollution is responsible for up to a quarter of deaths. Bob Buller's, again, foundational work in the 1970s and 80s tied the proximity of environmental pollution to neighborhoods of color a long time ago. And these injustices in space, you can call it environmental injustice or you can call it environmental racism, effectively have placed people of color in harm's way for decades. Unfortunately, we've seen this with lead poisoning as well in communities that are not prioritized by local politicians. We see higher exposure to environmental pollution and thus higher exposure to dangerous health outcomes.
So besides air quality, what are the other climate and environmental problems that affect human health? And I don't know if would you attribute the freeze that we were experiencing at this time last year, the extreme cold, would that be attributed to some climate change issues? We know, over 200 people lost their lives as a result of that freeze, and we had politicians who were making excuses, nonsensical excuses, that clean energy is what failed us, and clean energy doesn't function in the cold weather, and which was to me kind of ludicrous when I literally was looking in Alaska, and they use clean energy all the time. They just know how to winterize their products. We don't know how to winterize products. We don't know how to prepare them for the extreme heat. They're concerned if it's too hot, they're not going to work. If it's too cold, they're not going to work. But when we look at those extremes like that, is that part of what we're seeing in terms of the extremes in weather, extremes in temperature, people working outdoors, et cetera?
Absolutely. So let me answer your questions in reverse order. So starting with the freeze, these extremes in temperature in both directions have been predicted more intense as we change the climate through human forces. And so a lot of the climate scientists who work in Texas wrote an opinion piece in the Dallas Morning News about the cold snap, because so many times, every time there's a winter storm, you hear erroneously people saying things like climate change isn't real, we change cold snap. No, that's completely wrong. No, is that climate change, again, has been predicted for many decades to change atmospheric circulation patterns such that we have stronger cold snaps and stronger heat waves. The second part of your question, which was about what are the other climatic and environmental factors that affect human health beyond air quality. So some of the things people don't think about, again, extreme temperatures obviously affect people who work outdoors, but also our student athletes. Beyond extreme heat and extreme cold, vector-borne diseases, so for Zika or malaria, the extent of populations of mosquitoes is changing because of climate change. So mosquito breeding in space is changing. Tick populations and their prevalence in space is changing. So there was actually an outbreak in this past summer of West Nile virus. So these kinds of diseases that, again, probably fly under your radar are changing rapidly in response to climate change. Along with flooding. So obviously, I actually didn't live in Houston during Hurricane Harvey. I moved here in 2018, but flooding, extreme heat, and extreme cold have demonstrably affected communities in Houston literally every single year. We haven't had a year where we haven't experienced an environmental catastrophe. I think when we talk about improving our resilience in communities, you mentioned the power grid. It is also completely false that renewable power failed. In fact, wind turbines produce a large amount of the electricity that Texas is the US leader in wind production. What happened was the hydraulic fluid in natural gas generation stations froze. And so really that was a fossil fuel infrastructure, not renewable power. But if we want to save lives and be more resilient to climate extremes, we need to demand from our local officials, want increased power grid resilience. We need to make sure people have air conditioning. We need to make sure people have their heaters on. So this is really something that has to be changed at the policy level in order to improve it.
So I'm not sure if it's my age. I'm not sure if it's just a factor of children not being more resilient than they used to be. You know, we talked anecdotally, some friends of mine, you know, that, hey, man, there was a time you would be out and it's hot outside, but you'd be out all day playing and, you know, and come in, you know, and get a drink of water, maybe from a water hose or something, and just keep on going. And now it just seems like the heat and the humidity just zaps you. I mean, just in a way that, and I'm talking about prior to people having AC regularly available and things like that, when you just had box fans in the window, you know, it's just unbelievable now. Is this a phenomenon with climate change and global warming that we're just seeing in the US, or are we seeing it around the world? And how are we seeing instances of environmental injustice around the world at the level that we're seeing it in the US?
Absolutely. So first of all, you're not imagining that summers are getting worse. Temperatures, especially summer temperatures in Texas, have increased, and the length of summertime has increased on both sides. So summer high heat temperatures are starting earlier in the year, and they're persisting until later in the year. When I first moved here, I thought to myself, oh, Halloween is when it cools off. Now, not always.
Yeah.
If we zoom out to the rest of the world, certainly the environmental injustice issues that we see in the United States are still there. There is a lack of data available to us in countries like China and India as far as proximity to power generation plants and socioeconomic status of populations, for example. But I have no doubt that those problems exist. If you look at air quality in Africa, there have been a number of studies over the last 5 years or so that again show a robust relationship between air quality and infant mortality in Africa. We can also break down the environmental justice piece into country by country. So in the United States, we have a capacity to respond to environmental disasters. In a place like Bangladesh, where sea level rise is accelerating, they don't have $4 million to build seawalls to mitigate flooding, but the Netherlands does, right? So we see injustice manifesting as some countries have the wealth and resources to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and some countries do not. Some countries can afford to put scrubbers on their smokestacks, essentially, for power plants, and some countries do not. And so until we can equalize basically global wealth to developing nations, those countries are going to disproportionately feel the impacts of climate change. There was a United Nations Global Change Conference in the last decade or so where all of the government of the Maldives, which is a small island nation, held their meeting underwater in protest in scuba gear, because they were essentially saying, we are not responsible for climate change, and yet we are being affected. Our entire community is going to be underwater in 10 years. And so on the global scale, these injustices manifest country to country, but also absolutely regionally within other countries, similarly to the United States.
So you mentioned countries that are poor, that don't have the wealth and resources. In this country, we do. And so we looked at, for example, and now this is, you know, this happened in 2005. I'm thinking specifically Hurricane Katrina. And we see these very, very advanced levee systems, floodgate systems in the Netherlands and other countries. And we're sitting here in this country with dirt levees. And it seems to be not a skill issue, but a will issue that we just have chosen not to do it. We've chosen not to make that our priority. Am I missing something in that?
Not. The United States is profoundly behind on climate change infrastructure legislation. The current presidential administration, the Biden administration, has attempted many times now to pass reasonable climate change infrastructure legislation. The legislation in the United States has continually been blocked by the Republican Party, and I apologize for making it political, but really, there's no getting around it. Common sense climate change legislation has to include improvements to the resilience of our flood control and our power grids. We talked about that already. Transitioning to renewable energy sources that are more resilient to climate change. These are all things that have been proposed. There's a huge amount of offshore wind development going on that the private sector is really driving, that the government is not. And so you're absolutely correct that we are, 1 to 2 decades behind other developed nations in terms of preparing for climate change. In the specific case of the Mississippi, that's actually one of the things I work on. The entire Mississippi River Basin has flooded repeatedly at high cost to the U.S. economy and the societies who live along the Mississippi's banks. And the changes that we are planning to enact in that flood control system do not take into account the severity of flooding that is plausible when we look at climate model projections for that region. And so unless we really start to ring the alarm bells more loudly and politicians actually start listening to climate scientists, these disasters are not going to be they're not going to be protected against, if that makes sense.
Okay, so Dr. D, I'm going to play the devil's advocate because I'm convinced that everything in our society goes back to money, and so I'm going to say, as a member of the contractors lobbying group, the home builders lobbying group, the surveyors lobbying group, and every group that is making money from building houses, we don't want to see that happen, because when neighborhoods are wiped out and communities are wiped out, we get to make more money. Like if you actually build this structure that actually holds back water and keeps flooding from occurring, then we're not going to get to build X number of houses. We're not going to get to do, like, how do we shift the thinking of our country from just the short-term making of money to a long-term, this is what's good for our health and wellness, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and all of those things? Like, how do we shift that? Because there's somebody who's benefiting from the negative effects of climate change. There's somebody who's making money with things the way they are.
Well, I'm not an ethicist. However, it is true that it is difficult to reason with people who do not see the incredible past, current, and future economic cost of climate change. Okay, so per your example, say we have developers that a community gets wiped out by flooding and then they get to go in and build new houses. But that is still disproportionately affecting communities that are less able to pay for a new house and pay to relocate and can recoup their losses. So there's incredible social injustice housed in that economic argument. I think that there is actually incredible money to be made in a shift to green energy. And the private sector people like Tesla are already capitalizing on this. You don't have to lose money just because we switch to an economy geared around saving the planet. We do not have a planet B. Everybody has to breathe clean air. Everybody needs clean water. Most people can get behind access to green space. Most people want to protect national parks. If we do not create consensus amongst voters to combat the private interests that will destroy our water, our air, our parks, we will continue to see economic greed destroy our local and global environments. And there's been a ton of studies done by economists that show that dealing with this problem now is much cheaper than dealing with this problem later. And I would challenge people to say, oh, the home builders can make more money if these houses all get wiped out. Does that really consider the human cost? Does that really consider the emotional burden of those disasters? I am a very privileged person, and I live in Montrose, and we, during the freeze, lost water and power, and we were lucky that we could walk to Rice, and that Rice is on well water and it has its own electricity generation, and we could warm up. But even for me, it was so emotionally horrific to experience that. And that is the tip of the iceberg for other people who lost neighbors, who had to boil water for even longer. I mean, these are arguments that I find difficult to stomach because they completely discount the human experience. And if we if we are just focused on money, there will be no planet to exist on. Earth will be fine. It's our species that will not be fine. And again, even though it's hard to talk about the magnitude of climate change and environmental pollution, when I hear people say, oh, well, I'm going to lose money on this. Yeah, you're going to lose a lot of money when Houston's underwater. You're going to lose a lot more money then.
Yeah.
You really have to.
No, I think the short-sightedness and some of the arguments that are made by people on, depending on what side of the aisle they're on, it's kind of easy to make an argument against climate change when you can get on a plane and go to Cabo or Cancun, when it gets cold, at the drop of a hat. You don't really feel the impact or the effect of it. In this last segment of our show, Dr. D, give us, as a local community, what are some things we can do to help solve these problems and make a difference?
Yeah. So in terms of what people can do locally, there are many things, and you're absolutely right that this is complicated because our elected officials serve 2 to 6 year terms, and they're focused on getting supporters in the next, half decade. But this is inherently.
Well, Dr. D, let me stop you right there. So maybe that's the place to start. First, as an expert in this area, what do you think would be the timeline minimally if we made a concerted effort to see the kind of changes that we need to see in terms of reversing some of the damage that has occurred in our environment? What would be that minimal timeline?
So it's different for point source pollutants versus carbon pollutants and greenhouse gases. For point source pollutants, those things can change on timescales of weeks to months. If you shut down an incinerator or a power plant in a given area, those air pollutants are gone after the next weather system comes through 8 days later. Those changes are fast.
So that's kind of what we saw when cars shut down. Mm-hmm. People stayed home. We saw environment coming back. We saw animals coming back. We saw trees blooming and the like. That's that. So let's go to the end of the spectrum, on the opposite end of the spectrum, to see changes in terms of greenhouse gas pollutants and the things like that. How long would it take for us to see those kinds of changes?
So one of the biggest ways we can affect change is to reduce methane emissions. And methane is currently being flared at natural gas wells all over West Texas. And because methane is such a potent, strong greenhouse gas, it's really effective at trapping heat. If we were able to reduce methane, if we were able to reduce methane in the next 5 to 10 years, it would actually make a big dent in over the next several decades in terms of global temperature changes. It's a little more complicated with carbon because every molecule of carbon dioxide that gets put into the atmosphere stays there for about 400 years. So we talk about committed global warming or committed climate change from carbon dioxide emissions. But with point source pollutants and methane and a lot of these other short-lived greenhouse gases, we can make a strong impact over our lifetimes. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that came out just a month ago or so had strong recommendations for the emissions that we need to reduce now. Coming back to what people can do, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most powerful things you can do is talk about these problems in your community. This is an all hands on deck problem. We need people who are in the most affected communities to come into science and work on solving these problems, not just environmental science, but also social science. I heard a really interesting talk by the environmental justice leader of the Environmental Protection Agency, Matthew Tejedor, and I asked him, I said, listen, I'm a climate scientist. What can I do to improve environmental injustice outcomes for my community? And he said, you need to recruit more people from minority communities into science so that they can help solve these problems. So one of the things we can do is talk to young people, encourage them to go into this field, hold elected officials accountable, remind your community, okay, maybe climate change is a long-term thing and pretty scary, but we can deal with lead pollution today. You know, whether or not people are getting sick or not should not depend on their zip code. And we need to demand clean energy from our elected officials. It's really time to ring the alarm bells because unfortunately, people are literally dying, and they have been for decades. And unless we start screaming a bit more loudly about how climate change is a race issue, climate change is a gender issue, climate change is a class issue, these things are not going to change unless we mobilize. And there are lots of wonderful groups in Houston. So for example, the Citizens Climate Lobby has a chapter in Houston. Getting involved with these lobbying groups is a great way to demand political action from our local officials. Because unfortunately, individual actions like driving a car less, using less plastic, those are all really excellent steps we can take. But the changes that we will need require political legislation, right? We need a carbon tax. We need emissions reductions for air quality. The Trump administration rolled back almost 100 environmental regulations. The Biden administration has put more back in place. But if we don't hold polluters accountable, we will never improve this problem. Sorry, I'm rambling here, but I really feel strongly about, on the what we can do. We have to talk about this more frankly in our communities, and we have to mobilize politically.
Okay, so you talked about developing a path for new scientists of color to come into the field. I think, I don't know, would you consider that a short or long-term solution in terms of how to make that happen?
People that are in high school now will be trained and through college and graduate school in less than 10 years. This is a short-term goal. One of the things that I find so striking is that if you look at HBCUs across the United States, only 2 or 3 of them have an earth sciences department. And we desperately need to be training our communities of color in environmental science and air quality science and climate change science. And so one of the things that we're really looking into at Rice right now is how we coordinate with other universities here in Houston to build exchange programs so that students can come into our classes and learn these topics, but also maybe encourage our partner schools, hey, let's start a climate change program. You have an ag school, let's get more climate change into these courses. But so, without sounding like this is something like a pipe dream, I actually think that training more students of color in climate and environmental science is a very, very workable solution. And we also need to do a better, frankly, in earth science, explaining to students what kinds of jobs can they have, because job security is a real concern for all of our students. And
Yes.
so in my field, it's our job to explain to students, here are the types of jobs you can have. Here is the income potential for working in environmental consulting, or working for the Environmental Defense Fund, or working for a wind energy corporation. Our freshmen and our undergraduate students don't always know what the careers are in environmental science. And I can tell you that a large number of our incoming students are now asking, how can I get a job in environmental justice? How can I work to alleviate environmental racism through my career? And so we need to create these communities or these opportunities for students, and we also need to train them in the incredibly interdisciplinary scope that environmental challenges pose.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I don't know who is listening and who has a junior or senior who's about to graduate, but I was always told in grad school in particular, don't major in a subject, major in a professor. So find out where Dr. Sylvia D is teaching and what she's teaching, and major in Dr. Sylvia D. That's my recommendation for those who may be interested in civil and environmental engineering, earth sciences. I think one of the things I hope people have gotten from our show today is how interrelated all of this is. When you talk about agriculture, when you talk about farming, ranches and rodeos are really big in this country. All of those things are going to be affected by the extremes in weather, extreme cold, extreme hot, and everything in between. People who work outside, that's an issue. And then the neighborhood and communities that you live in. Is there a way for people to find out in terms of their zip code or their neighborhood beyond just some of the anecdotal evidence, or maybe just the feeling that we just seem to have a lot of cancers in our area? Is there a way for people to find out what's going on in their community so they can be more mobilized in terms of recognizing this is a problem and we need to get in this fight?
Absolutely. So there's some great resources from TSU professors like Erthea Nance and Bob Bullard. There's also the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, Q. They publish local pollution data on a daily and weekly scale. And scientists at your local university can work with your community to take a look at those geographic disparities in air quality. There is Environment Texas, which is another nonprofit that seeks to reduce harmful environmental pollutants in our communities. And in general, don't be afraid to reach out to someone at Texas Southern or University of Houston or Rice or Texas A&M, wherever you live. Reach out to the faculty in civil environmental in the earth science department and ask questions. Ask, how can we get access to this data? How can you help us visualize this data for our community? And people will help. We are passionate about helping solve these problems. Scientists get it not because we want fame and glory, but especially, as climate and environmental scientists, we really want to help solve these problems. We are just as passionate about reducing harm as our local communities are. So please, I would say reach out to scientists. It is our job to help reduce harm in our communities.
Before we go, I failed to ask you, I think what may be an obvious question that I should have asked. Um, what areas in the Houston area are hotspots? What areas are there? Is there, lawsuits in place, or were you seeing environmental injustice? If people are not fighting, they need to get to the fight. Have you identified any neighborhoods that are hotspots in Houston, in particular, the Houston metropolitan area?
So I apologize. I'm actually very new to Houston, and so I wish I had a strong answer to that question. But there are lawsuits pending. The first lawsuits came in the late 1970s related to the density of African American communities near landfill sites, and that was in Houston. And so there are studies that have shown people who live near the ship channel are particularly vulnerable. People who live near the major highways, near the 45, are particularly vulnerable. People who live in floodplains, places that have historically seen really severe flooding, are particularly vulnerable. And in terms of air quality, I can't give you a zip code or neighborhood level breakdown, but I think relying on the experts in Houston, again, experts in environmental justice like Bob Bullard, will know that off the top of their head. And we can get access to that information. There's also the Houston Climate Action Plan. The city of Houston has done its own due diligence on these questions, and that information might be available in that plan as well.
Well, I tell you what, this is a subject that we want to continue to talk about. We'll work to get Prof. Bullard in as well to, again, continue this discussion, because I think it's an important discussion that many people, as you said earlier, we hear things like, recycling and don't top off your gas and, those kinds of things. Whereas there are major polluters out there who are given a free rein to do what they're doing. And basically whatever efforts are being made by people are virtually being erased because corporations are not being held accountable. And so we're going to have to figure out how to fight that battle. Dr. D, thank you so much for being with us on tonight. I know it was a challenge to get you here and get you on, but I'm glad we were able to make it happen, and we will certainly be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. Again, I encourage listeners, if you want to chat or if this interests you, please get in touch with me. My Rice email is available on our website, and it was just a with you. So thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you. The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And I don't know if there's a better fight that we can get involved in than the fight for our climate, the fight for our environment, because this is a fight that not only affects us personally, but it affects those who are coming behind us. And the truth of the matter is, those who came before us, many of them did not have the foresight, did not believe that what they were doing was damaging our society, damaging our world near as much as it is, because they just saw things continuing to move on. Well, we are a generation that know better. And because we know better, we're now responsible to do better. Let's make sure we do better, not just for ourselves, but for our children, for our grandchildren, and for their children. I'm Dr. D.Z. Cofield for Real World Real Talk, signing off. Thank you for listening on your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep keep it real, and stay real.